Across the eastern Mediterranean, palaces fell almost at once. How can civilizations crash together? This is the haunting question posed by the collapse of the Late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE. Between Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, a web of powerful kingdoms and wealthy city-states had flourished for centuries. They built lavish palaces, corresponded in multiple languages, and sent ambassadors and princesses across the sea. Their economies depended on long-distance exchange. Copper from Cyprus and tin from faraway mountains were turned into bronze weapons and tools. Grain, textiles, and ivory flowed between ports. When those palaces burned, it wasn't just a few buildings destroyed, it was an entire network unraveling. Understanding why this happened means looking at the system they had created. The Late Bronze Age network stretched from Mycenaean Greece to the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, from Canaanite ports like Ugarit and Tyre to Pharaonic Egypt. Mycenae sent wool, wine, and mercenaries in exchange for metals and luxury goods. The Hittites controlled inland routes and produced iron in small amounts. Egypt provided grain, gold from Nubia, and the stability of a powerful monarchy. Cyprus, known as Alatia, shipped copper ingots shaped like ox hides, while Ugarit served as a cosmopolitan entrepot connecting caravans and ships. All of these polities communicated through letters, treaties, and marriages. That level of interconnection produced prosperity, but it also created dependencies. Palaces stocked warehouses with imported goods and paid their officials and soldiers from surpluses. If supplies faltered, the system would strain. The complexity of this world was remarkable. Scribes working in cuneiform or linear B kept track of taxes and stored goods. Temples and palaces redistributed food to workers and craftsmen. International diplomacy rested on trust and reciprocity. Kings who broke promises could be ostracized or attacked. Yet the very webs that bound them together made them fragile. Bronze production required tin sources hundreds of kilometers away. Egyptian grain shipments could feed Canaan, but if the Nile's floods failed, shortages rippled outward. Large armies and labor projects demanded reliable food and metal supplies. When multiple stressors hit at once, climate shifts, natural disasters, migrations, or wars, there was little room for flexibility. The Late Bronze Age is a classic case of complexity breeding vulnerability. Environmental stress was one major factor. Dendrochronology and pollen studies indicate that the eastern Mediterranean experienced episodes of severe drought during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Harvests declined, famine appears in Hittite and Egyptian texts. When grain yields dropped, tax revenues shrank and peasants went hungry. At the same time, this region sits on the boundaries of several tectonic plates. Archaeological layers at Mycenae, Ugarit, and Hattusa show collapsed walls and cracked floors consistent with earthquakes. A large quake could topple a palace and trigger fires. Repeated droughts and quakes did not by themselves destroy civilizations, but they weakened them. Leaders struggling to feed their people or rebuild after disasters were less able to respond to additional shocks. Into this unstable situation came groups of migrants and raiders referred to by Egyptian sources as the Sea Peoples. Reliefs at Medinet Habu and texts from the reigns of Merneptah and Rameses III describe battles with seaborne groups carrying ox carts and families. Names like Shurdan, Shekelesh, and Peliset suggest a mix of origins, perhaps from western Anatolia, the Aegean, or farther afield. Some scholars think these groups were displaced by drought or political turmoil and were seeking new homes. Others view them as opportunistic pirates taking advantage of weakened coastal defenses. In any case, they attacked or threatened coastal cities from Anatolia to the Levant. By disrupting maritime trade and causing populations to flee inland, they compounded existing crises. Internal tensions also undermined palatial authority. The Late Bronze Age economy was hierarchical. Elites controlled land and resources, while commoners paid taxes and labored on public projects. When drought caused shortages, resentment grew. Hittite texts complain of revolts in western Anatolia. Linear B tablets from Pylos record urgent requests for weapons and mention groups of troublemakers. Archaeologists find hurriedly built walls inside palaces as if rulers feared attack. Pressed by famine and heavy levies, farmers may have abandoned their land or turned against their overlords. In some places, regional leaders resented royal demands and withheld tribute. These social strains weakened central control just when external pressure was mounting. They also made cooperation between kingdoms more difficult, eroding the diplomatic ties that had sustained the system. Between roughly 1220 and 1170 BCE, the palatial centers fell one after another. The Hittite capital at Hattusa was burned and abandoned. In Greece, the palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes were destroyed or deserted within decades. Ugarit, a wealthy port, was obliterated. Excavators found letters to its allies still sitting on clay tablets, never delivered. Troy, controlling the Dardanelles, shows a destruction layer dated to about this time. In each case, archaeologists see signs of fire, smashed walls, and sudden abandonment. These collapses were not always simultaneous to the day, but within a single human lifetime, most of the major centers were gone. Without palaces to collect and distribute resources, the fragile network disintegrated. When the palaces disappeared, so did their administrative systems. Scribes who kept records and managed surpluses were killed or dispersed. In Greece, the linear B script vanished, and for centuries the inhabitants were illiterate. In Anatolia, knowledge of cuneiform largely died out until revived later by the Neo-Hittites. Without written contracts and archives, organizing large caravans or maritime expeditions became difficult. Famine likely followed. Archaeological evidence shows signs of malnutrition in some skeletons, and many coastal settlements were abandoned. The long-distance trade in copper and tin halted, so bronze tools and weapons became scarce. People reverted to subsistence farming and local barter. A period sometimes called the Greek Dark Age began, marked by smaller settlements and fewer monumental buildings. Out of this collapse grew a new age. Iron, which had been a rare novelty, became more common because iron ore is widely available and does not require distant trade. Early iron was brittle, but smiths learned to harden it by heating and quenching, creating tools and weapons that were eventually superior to bronze. Smaller political units emerged: chiefdoms in Greece, Neo-Hittite city-states in Anatolia and Syria, and Phoenician trading towns along the Levant. Assyria rebuilt itself with iron-armed armies and eventually established a vast empire. The Phoenicians developed a simple alphabetic writing system that spread across the Mediterranean and evolved into Greek and Roman scripts. These innovations arose because people had to adapt to local resources and new realities. Modern researchers see the Bronze Age collapse as a systemic failure rather than a single catastrophe. Climate change, earthquakes, migration, war, and social unrest interacted in a web of feedback loops. The very connectivity that had enriched the late Bronze Age created vulnerabilities, so when multiple stresses hit, the system could not cope. There are clear parallels to today's globalized world, where supply chains and information networks can magnify shocks. Yet the story also contains hope. Out of crisis came innovation, the alphabet, iron technology, and new political ideas. Societies that diversified resources and decentralized power were more resilient. The Bronze Age collapse therefore invites us not only to marvel at past calamity, but also to think about how to build systems that can adapt and endure. Even so, the collapse was not the end of civilization. Cultural memories of the palaces and their fall persisted. Greek epic poetry, like the Iliad and Odyssey, may preserve echoes of Mycenaean warlords and the destruction of Troy. Biblical stories of the Philistines, perhaps descended from sea peoples, reflect the mixing of populations in the Levant. The Phoenicians, inheritors of Canaanite cities, expanded westward, founding colonies like Carthage and spreading their alphabet. In Anatolia and Syria, Neo-Hittite and Aramaean states blended traditions in art and religion. Over centuries, these societies created new political forms: the Greek polis, the Israelite kingdom, and the Assyrian and Persian empires. The collapse forced people to reimagine their world, and from that reimagining came innovations that shaped the Iron Age. Remembering both the destruction and the regeneration helps us see collapse not just as an end, but as a beginning.